From Toronto, we present The Best of Ideas, the first broadcast in the expanded 1966-67 season. I'm your host, Ken Haslam. Tonight, and for the next 5 weeks, we begin with the 1966 Massey Lectures. This year, the CBC's invited lecturer is Paul Goodman, and his theme, The Moral Ambiguity of America. Dr. Goodman, a social critic, author, and lecturer, is regarded as one of the most penetrating and radical critics of American society. Tonight, The Empty Society by Paul Goodman.
During Eisenhower's second administration, I wrote a book describing how hard it was for young people to grow up in the corporate institutions of American society. Yet the statistics at that time indicated that most were content to be secure as personnel of big corporations. A few deviated in impractical and certainly unpolitical ways, like being beat or delinquent. The system itself, like its president, operated with a cheerful and righteous self-satisfaction. There were no signs of its being vulnerable, although a loud chorus of intellectual critics, like myself, was sounding off against it. We were spoilsports. Less than 10 years later, the feeling is different. It turns out that we critics were not altogether unrealistic. The system of institutions is still grander and more computerized, but it seems to have lost its morale. The baronial corporations are making immense amounts of money and are more openly and heavily subsidized by the monarch in Washington. The processing of the young is extended for longer years and its tempo speeded up. More capital and management are exported, interlocking with international capital, and more of the world, including Canada, is brought under American control. When necessary, remarkable military technology is brought to bear. At home, there is no political check, for no matter what the currents of opinion, by and large, the dominant system wreaks its will, managing the parliamentary machinery to look like consensus. Nevertheless, the feeling of justification is gone. Sometimes we seem to be bullying it through only in order to save face. Often enterprises seem to be expanding simply because the managers cannot think of any other use of energy and resources. The economy is turning into a war economy. There are warnings of ecological disaster, pollution, congestion, poisoning, mental disease, anomie. We have discovered that there is hardcore poverty at home that is not easy to liquidate. Abroad, unlike the success of the Marshall Plan in Europe in the 40s, it increasingly appears that poverty and unrest in Asia, Africa, and South America are not helped by our methods of assistance, but are perhaps made worse. There are flashes of suspicion, like flashes of lightning, that the entire system may be unviable. And now, very many young people no longer want to cooperate with such a system. Indeed, a large and rapidly growing number, already more than 5% of college students, use language that is openly revolutionary or apocalyptic, as if in their generation they were going to make the French Revolution. More and more often, direct civil disobedience seems to make obvious sense. We are exerting more power and feeling less right. What does that mean for the future? I have heard serious people argue for 3 plausible yet drastically incompatible predictions about America during the next generation. None of them happy. Some feel, with a kind of Virgilian despair, that the American empire will succeed and will impose for a long time, at home and abroad, its meaningless management and showy style of life. For instance, we will win in Vietnam, though such a victory of brute military technology would be a moral disaster. Clubbing together with the other nuclear powers, we will stave off the nuclear war and stop history with the new Congress of Vienna. American democracy will vanish into an establishment of promoters, mandarins, and technicians, although for a while maintaining an image of democracy, as in the days of Augustus and Tiberius. And all this is probably the best possible outcome, given the complexities of high technology, urbanization, mass education, and overpopulation. Others believe, with dismay and horror, that our country is overreaching and is bound for doom. but nothing can be done because policy cannot be influenced. Controlling communications, creating incidents that it then mistakes for history, deceived by its own intelligence agents, our system is mesmerized. Like the Mikado, Washington is captive of its military-industrial complex. The way we manage the economy and technology must increase anomie and crime. Since the war economy eats up brains and capital, we will soon be a fifth-rate economic power. With a few setbacks abroad, for instance, when we force a major South American country to become communist, and with the increasing disorder on the streets that is inevitable because our cities are unworkable, there will be a police state. The atom bombs may then go off. Such being the forecast, the part of wisdom is escape, and those who cultivate LSD are on the right track. Others hold that the Americans are too decent to succumb to fascism and too spirited to remain impotent clients of a managerial elite, and the tide of protest will continue to rise. We must invent new forms. To be sure, the present climate of emergency is bad for the social invention and experiment that are indispensable, and there is no doubt that establishment methods of organization make everybody stupid from top to bottom. But there is hope precisely in the young. They understand the problem in their bones. Of course, they don't know much, and their disaffection both from tradition and from the adult world makes it hard for them to learn anything. Nevertheless, we will learn in the inevitable conflict, which will hopefully be mainly nonviolent. I myself hold this third view. American society is on a bad course, but there is hope for reconstruction through conflict. I am eager, as well as honored, to be talking to a Canadian audience on the state of American society, and especially to the Canadian young. You people are not yet so wrongly committed as we. Your land is less despoiled, your cities are more manageable, you are not yet so sold on mass miseducation. You are not in the trap of militarism. A large minority of you are deeply skeptical of American methods and oppose the unquestioned extension of American power. Some of us Americans have always wistfully hoped that you Canadians would teach us a lesson or two, though, to be frank, you have usually let us down. In these lectures on our ambiguous moral position, I shall have to talk a good deal about style. To illustrate the current style of American enterprise, let me analyze a small actual incident. It is perfectly typical, banal. Washington has allotted several billions of dollars to the schools. The schools are not teaching very well, but there is no chance that anybody will upset the apple cart and ask if so much doing of lessons is the right way to educate the young altogether. Rather, there is a demand for new methods and mechanical equipment which will disturb nobody, and electronics is the latest thing that every forward-looking local school board must be proud to buy. So to cut in on this melon, electronics corporations, IBM, Xerox, etc., have hastened to combine with or take over textbook houses. My own publisher, Random House, has been bought up by the Radio Corporation of America. Just now, General Electric and Time Incorporated, that owns a textbook house, have put nearly $40 million into a joint subsidiary called General Learning. And an editor of Life magazine, a part of Time Inc., has been relieved of his duties for 5 weeks in order to prepare a prospectus on the broad educational needs of America and the world, to come up with exciting proposals so that General Learning can move with purpose into this unaccustomed field. The editor has collected and is boning up on the latest high thought on education, and in due course he invites me to lunch to pick my brains for something new and radical. The sky, he assures me, is the limit. I am known, let me explain, as a severe critic of the school establishment. Perhaps, he tells me at lunch, there is no unique place for General Learning. They'll probably end up as prosaic makers of school hardware, but we ought to give it a try. Consider the premises of this odd situation, where first they have the organization and the technology, and then they try to dream up a use for it. The competence required is to have a big organization and sales force, and to be to have the prestige and connections plausibly to get the subsidy. Usually it is good to have some minimal relation to the ostensible function. For example, a textbook, subsidiary, related to schooling, or time life, related to, let us say, learning. But indeed, when an expanding corporation becomes very grand, it generates an expertise of its own called systems development, applicable to anything. For example, as an expert in systems development, North American Aviation is hired to reform the penal system of California. There is no longer need to demonstrate acquaintance with any particular human function. Naturally, with the divorce of enterprise from utility and competence, there goes a heavy emphasis on rhetoric to prove utility and competence. So an editor must be reassigned for 5 weeks to write a rationale. It is his task to add ideas or talking points to the enterprise, like a rapper. The personnel of expanding corporations, of course, are busy people and have not had time to think of many concrete ideas. They can, however, phone writers and concerned professionals. Way-out radicals especially do a lot of thinking, since they have little practical employment. And since the enterprise is free-floating anyway, it is dandy to include in the prospectus something daring or even meaningful. In an affluent society that can afford it, there is something jolly about such an adventure of the electronics giant, the mighty publisher, the National Science Foundation that has made curriculum studies, and local school boards that want to be in the swim. Somewhere down the line, however, this cabal of decision-makers is going to coerce the time of life of real children and control the activity of classroom teachers. These who are directly engaged in the human function of learning and teaching have no say in what goes on. This introduces a more sober note. Some of the product of the burst of corporate activity and technological virtuosity will be useful, some not. The pedagogical evidence is mixed and not extensive, but the brute fact is that the children are quite incidental to the massive intervention of the giant combination. I have chosen a wry example, but I could have chosen the leader of the American economy, the complex of cars, oil, and roads. This outgrew its proper size perhaps 30 years ago. Now it is destroying both the cities and the countryside. It has been shown to be careless of even elementary safety. Rather, let me turn abruptly to the Vietnam War. We notice the same family traits. Whatever made us embark on this adventure, by now we can define the Vietnam War as a commitment looking for a reason, or at least a rationalization. There has been no lack of policy statements, rhetorical gestures, manufactured incidents, and certainly plain lies. But as the war has dragged on and grown, all these have proved to be mere talking points. Ringing true, however, has been the fanfare about the superb military technology that we have deployed. The theme is used as a chief morale builder for the troops. In the absence of adequate political reasons, some have even said that the war is largely an occasion for testing new hardware and techniques. It is eerie to hear on the television an airman enthusiastically praised the split-second scheduling of his missions to devastate rice fields. Yet what emerges most strikingly from our thinking about and prosecution of the Vietnam War is, again, the input-output accounting, the systems development, and the purely incidental significance of the human beings involved. The communiqué are concerned mainly with the body count of VC in ratio to our own losses, since there is a theory that in wars of this kind one must attain a ratio of 5-to-1 or 10-to-1. According to various estimates, it costs $50,000 to $250,000 to kill one Vietnamese, hopefully an enemy. Similarly, the bombing of civilians and the destructions of their livelihood occur as if no human beings were involved. They are officially spoken of as unfortunate but incidental. We claim that we have no imperialist aims in Vietnam, though we are building air bases of some very heavy concrete and steel. But evidently, old-fashioned imperialism was preferable, since it tried to keep the subjugated population in existence for taxes and labor. At home, correspondingly, college students are deferred from the draft because, it is said, they will be necessary to man the professions in scientific technology, while farm boys, Negroes, and Spanish Americans are drafted because they are otherwise good for nothing. That is to say, war is not regarded as a dread emergency in which each one does his bit, but as part of the ongoing business of society in which fighting and dying are usual categories of the division of labor. But this is bound to be the case when 20% of the gross national product is spent on war, using a multiplier of 2. When more than half of the gross investment since 1945 has been in war industry, and when much of higher education and science is devoted to war technology. The Americans are not a warlike or bloodthirsty people, though violent. The dehumanizing of war is part of a general style of enterprise and control in which human utility and even the existence of particular human beings are simply not a paramount consideration. Great armaments manufacturers have said that they are willing and ready to convert their capital and skill to peaceful production when given the signal. This seems to mean that it is indifferent to them what they enterprise. Studies of American workmen have shown that they take their moral and aesthetic standards not from family, church, friends, or personal interests, but from the organization and style of work at the plant. And I think that this explains the present peculiar situation that other nations of the world regard our behavior in the Vietnam War with a kind of horror, whereas Americans sincerely talk as if it were a messy job to be done as efficiently as possible. This brings us to a broader question. What do we mean by technical efficiency in our system? Corporate and bureaucratic societies, whether ruled by priests, mandarins, generals, or business managers, have always tended to diminish the importance of personal needs and human feeling. Nevertheless, modern corporate societies that wield a high technology are liable to a unique temptation. Since they do not exploit common labor, they may tend to exclude the majority of human beings altogether as useless for the needs of the system, and therefore as not quite persons. This has been the steady tendency in America. The aged are ruled out at an earlier age, the young until a later age. We have liquidated most small farmers. There is no place for the poor, for example, more than 20 million Negroes and Latin Americans. A rapidly increasing number are certified as insane or otherwise incompetent. These groups already comprise more than a majority of the American population. Some authorities say, although others deny, that with full automation, most of the rest will also be useless. There is nothing malevolent or heartless in this exclusion. The tone is not like that of the old exploitative society, when people were thrown out of work during the lows of the business cycle. For humane and political reasons, even extraordinary efforts are made to shape the excluded into the dominant style so they can belong. Even though the system is going to need only a few percent with elaborate academic training, all the young are subjected to 12 years of schooling and 40% go to college. There is every kind of training and social service to upgrade the poor and to make the handicapped productive members of society. At high cost of effort and suffering, mentally retarded children must be taught to read, if only cat and rat. But a frank look shows, I think, that for most, the long schooling is a way of keeping the young on ice. The job training is busy work, and the social services turn people into community dependents for generations. Much of the anxiety about the handicapped and the underprivileged is suburban squeamishness that cannot tolerate difference. What is never done is to change the rules of the system, to redefine usefulness in terms of how people are, and to shape the dominant style to people. This cannot be done because it would be inefficient and indeed degrading, for there is only one right way to exist. Do it our way, or else you are not quite a person. Inevitably, such self-righteous inflexibility is self-mesmerizing and self-proving, for other methods and values are not allowed to breathe and prove themselves. Often it would be cheaper to help people to be in their own way, or at least to let them be. but anything in a different or outmoded style has deviant or underprivileged written on it, and no expense is spared to root it out in the name of efficiency. Thus, it would have been cheaper to pay the small farmers to stay put if they wished. It would be far cheaper to give money directly to the urban poor to design their own lives, rather than to try to make them shape up. Very many of the young would get a better education and grow up usefully to themselves and society if the school money were used for real apprenticeships, or even if they were given the school money to follow their own interests, ambitions, and even fantasies, rather than penning them up for lengthening years in increasingly regimented institutions. But none of these simpler and cheaper ways would be efficient. The clinching proof is that they would be hard to administer. Also, are the people useless? The concept of efficiency is largely systemic. It depends on the goals of the system, which may be too narrowly and inflexibly conceived. It depends on the ease of administration, which is considered as more important than economic or social costs. It depends also on the method of calculating costs, which may create a false image of efficiency by ruling out intangibles that do not happen to suit the method. This source of error becomes very important in advanced urban economies where the provision of personal and social services grows rapidly in proportion to hardware and food production and distribution. In providing services, whether giving information, selling, teaching children, admitting to college, assigning jobs, serving food, or advising on welfare, standardization and punch cards may seem to fulfill the function, but they may do so at the expense of frayed nerves, waiting in line, bad mistakes, misfitting, and cold soup. In modern conditions, the tailor-made improvisations of fallible but responsive human beings may be increasingly indispensable, rather than useless. In the jargon of Frank Riesman, there is a great need for sub-professionals. Yet the mass production and business machine style, well adapted to manufacturing hardware and calculating logistics, will decide that people are useless anyway, since they can theoretically be dispensed with. It is a curious experience to hear a gentleman from the Bureau of the Budget explain the budget of the War on Poverty according to cost-benefit computation. He can demonstrate that the participation of the poor in administering a program is disadvantageous. He can show you the flow chart. He cannot understand why poor people make a fuss on this point. It is useless to explain to him that they do not trust the program, nor the director, but would like to get the money for their own purposes. Abroad, the Americans still engage in plenty of old-fashioned exploitation of human labor, as in Latin America. Yet the tendency is again to regard the underdeveloped peoples as not quite persons, and to try to shape them up by sometimes generous assistance in our own style. For example, one of the radical ideas of General Learning, the subsidiary of General Electric and Time Inc., is to concentrate on electronic devices to teach literacy to the masses of children in poor countries. We must export our great society. Our enterprises are eager to build highways and pipelines through the jungle, to multiply bases for our airplanes, and to provide other items of the American standard of living, for which the Western-trained native political leaders have rising aspirations. Unfortunately, this largesse must often result in disrupting age-old cultures, fomenting tribal wars, inflating prices and wages, and reducing decent poverty to starvation, causing the abandonment of farms and disastrous instant urbanization, making dictatorships inevitable, and drawing simple peoples into great power conflicts. And woe if they do not then shape up, if they want to develop according to their own local prejudices, for example, land reform. They become an uncontrollable nuisance, surely therefore allied with our enemies, and better dead than red. In this lecture, I have singled out two trends of the dominant organization of American society: its increasing tendency to expand meaninglessly for its own sake, and its tendency to exclude human beings as useless. It is an empty society, the obverse face of the affluent society. When Adam Smith spoke of the wealth of nations, he did not mean anything like this. The meaningless expansion and the excluding of people are different things, but in our society they are essentially related. Lack of meaning begins to occur when the immensely productive economy overmatures and lives by creating demand instead of meeting it. When the check of the free market gives way to monopolies, subsidies, and captive consumers. When the sense of community vanishes and public goods are neglected and resources despoiled. When there is maid work or war to reduce unemployment. And when the measure of economic health is not increasing well-being, but abstractions like the gross national product and the rate of growth. Human beings tend to be excluded when a logistic style becomes universally pervasive, so that values and data that cannot be standardized and programmed are disregarded, when function is adjusted to the technology rather than technology to the function, when technology is confused with autonomous science, which is a good in itself, rather than being limited by political prudence, when there develops an establishment of managers and experts who alone license and allot resources, and this establishment deludes itself that it knows the only right method and is omnicompetent, then common folk become docile clients, maintained by sufferance, or they are treated as deviant. It is evident that, for us, these properties of the empty society are essentially related. If we did not exclude so many as not really persons, we would have to spend more of our substance on worthwhile goods, including subsistence goods, both at home and abroad. We would have to provide a more human environment for the children to grow up in. There would be more paths to grow up and more ways of being a person. On the other hand, if we seriously and efficiently tackled the problems of alienation, anomie, riot, pollution, congestion, urban blight, degenerative and mental disease, etc., we would find ourselves paying much more particular attention to persons and neighborhoods, rather than treating them as standard items. We would have a quite different kind of engineering and social science, and we would need all the human resources available to us. Certainly, we would stop talking presumptuously about the Great Society and find ourselves struggling in the confusing conditions of modern times for a decent society. The chief danger to American society at present and to the world from American society is our mindlessness, induced by empty institutions. It is a kind of mesmerism, a self-delusion of formal rightness that affects both leaders and people. We have all the talking points, but less and less content. The Americans are decent folk, generous and fairly compassionate. They are not demented and fanatical, like some other imperial powers of the past and present, but on the contrary, rather skeptical and with a sense of humor. They are not properly called arrogant, though perhaps presumptuous. But we have lost our horse sense for which we were once noted. This kind of intelligence was grounded not in history or learning, nor in finesse of sensibility and analysis, which we do not have, but in the habit of making independent judgments and in democratically rubbing shoulders with all kinds and conditions. We have lost our horse sense by becoming personnel of a mechanical system and exclusive suburbanites, by getting out of contact with real jobs and real people. We suddenly have developed an establishment, but our leaders do not have the tradition and self-restraint to come on like an establishment. Thus, we are likely to wreak havoc, not because of greed, ideology, or arrogance, but because of a bright strategy of the theory of games and an impatient conviction that other people aren't quite persons.
The Empty Society, the first of the 1966 Massey Lectures by Dr. Paul Goodman, renowned American social critic. The Massey Lectures are organized by Robert McCormick and produced in New York by Del McKenzie. Over most of these stations, ideas will continue after a 3-minute newscast until midnight. Stay with us to meet 3 Canadian poets. Ken Haslam speaking.
This is the CBC Radio Network.
Ken Haslam speaking for the Best of Ideas from CBC Toronto. Each Monday, for 1.5 hours, the Ideas Program Unit presents the best of ideas, beginning this season with the 1966 Massey Lectures. The CBC's invited lecturer is Paul Goodman, whose theme for the 6-week series is the moral ambiguity of America. In his second lecture tonight, Dr. Goodman suggests some positive human action to restore direction to the empty society. He calls this talk Counter-Forces for a Decent Society.
The question is whether or not our beautiful libertarian, pluralist, and populist experiment is viable in modern conditions. If it's not, I don't know any other acceptable politics, and I'm a man without a country. The ambiguity of values in America is really striking. Often, it is as if there were a line down the front page of the New York Times, with half of the stories making one despondent, afraid, or indignant, and half cheerful, hopeful, and proud. Needless to say, the trends that please me are called un-American by some, but you will recognize them as classically American. With a few exceptions, the Supreme Court has been extending liberty of publication, art, assembly, and political action. It has condoned flagrant examples of civil disobedience. Even more significant are its decisions limiting the police, forbidding wiretapping and forced confession, and tightening due process. For here the conflict with the system is evident. Capital punishment is being rather rapidly abolished, largely, I think, because of the general revulsion, well expressed by Camus, against the mechanical state snuffing out a life. New York and the District of Columbia have reformed the bail system to rescue the poor from rotting in jail before trial, and other states will follow suit. These reforms are the reverse of the moral insensitivity I spoke of in my first lecture. It is not 1984. We are as yet unwilling to identify with the system in which we nevertheless act. Some cities have adopted civilian review boards to review complaints against the police. Legislation is proposed for a public defender to offset the advantage of the state attorney's staff and business machines. There is talk of an ombudsman to review complaints against government bureaucracy. Unwilling to alter the framework, people hanker for a kind of Roman tribune to intervene with his drastic personal veto. A better proposal, in my opinion, is for disadvantaged groups like Negroes to police their own neighborhoods according to their own mores. Puritanism persists, yet there is a remarkable shift away from moralism and hypocrisy and toward plain inconsistency. For instance, narcotics laws are strengthened and extended to LSD and other non-addictives, but there is a strong campaign for the English system for the addictive drugs, and champions of LSD have a messianic fervor claiming that the issue is between conformism and a personal or religious way of life. We have the odd situation that penalties become heavier while public opinion is more and more uncertain. The continuing sexual revolution deserves special notice. Here the inconsistency between high thought and the repressive laws in sexless schools is blatant. But the most practical change has been not the actual sexual behavior of the adolescents and adults, which so far has not produced much poetry or deep joy, though it is better than the sexual climate in which I grew up. Rather, it is the now widely accepted freedom of the children, the relaxed toilet training, permitted masturbation, nakedness, and formal dress. A generation ago, we were warned that this freedom would produce an unruly brood. It has, and I like the results. There is a revival in the churches, and we find clergymen in the unlikely position of fighting for migrant farm workers and against the drug and sex laws, and confessing that God is not on our side in Vietnam and in manufacturing nuclear bombs. The churches have latched onto non-directive community development. Some of them have sponsored the most daring and unofficious protest organizations in legal defense for Negroes and Spanish Americans. In New York City, the best community theaters, indeed the best theaters, are in churches, nor are the plays lacking in dirty words. And on many college campuses, the young existentialist chaplain, or even the Catholic, is the center of radical student activity. There is an odd explosion in the arts, with an immense number of amateurs of a kind of urban folk art in all genres. It is entirely inauthentic in style, combining misunderstood fragments of international culture with commercialized mountain music and stereotyped urban naturalism. Yet it is authentic to the actual urban confusion. On a more intellectual level, there have been lovely sporadic attempts to enliven the cities with happenings in the park, spontaneous fence painting, and vest pocket playgrounds laid out by adolescents. Unfortunately, since the urban folk have neither tradition nor resources, and their art is largely an outcry of alienation, there is no popular effort to cope with the big horrors of urban ugliness and pollution. Even so, what the folk do has more vitality than the synthetic culture centers sponsored by government and foundations. Economically, there is an increase in minimum wages and unionization of the most exploited groups, for instance, hospital attendants and migrant farmhands. More significantly, there is a growing sentiment, which I think will prevail, for a guaranteed minimum income, which would be far preferable in the United States to the present system of welfare payments and social services. It would be a giant step toward making decent poverty possible, reopening independent choice of how to live, and encouraging small businesses and rural reconstruction. It would loosen top-down control. The most spectacular battle with American business as usual has been, of course, the belated movement for Negro emancipation. And at least in the South, the movement has given remarkable proof that decentralized grassroots action, loosely coordinated, can exert political power. The Negro movement is part of a tide of populist direct action rising throughout the nation. There are almost daily marches, boycotts, sit-ins, protests to the point of smashing chairs at city council meetings, civil disobedience to the point of filling the jails. Neighborhoods rally en masse to stop high-handed urban renewal and highway commissioners. The League for Sexual Freedom parades with floats and dirty words. The hustlers and waifs of the Tenderloin in San Francisco organize for self-help and a voice in the local Economic Opportunity Council. Negroes march against the police outrage and end with a riot. Resentment at not being taken seriously by municipal social workers easily consolidates into organization a la Saul Alinsky. Students sit down around an administration spokesman on foreign policy because he will not answer their questions. 700 students are arrested in Berkeley because the college administration has lied to them. It is a ferment of populism occurring under urban conditions because finally there is no other way to exist. About 50% of Americans are under 26. Nearly 40% of the college age group go to college. Of the present collegians, there are now 6 million in 2,000 institutions. It is estimated that 5% are in some activity of the radical youth movement. This does not seem a great proportion, but it has increased at least tenfold in the last decade, and it and the number of its alumni will certainly increase even more rapidly in the next years. More important, unlike the Negroes, the radical young are not only middle-class collegians, graduate students or graduates, but they are also disproportionately the best students and from the best schools. They are an economic force looming large among the indispensable inheritors of the dominant power in society. And although, or perhaps because, they do not share a common ideology, but rather a common sentiment and style, in showdown situations like the troubles in Berkeley, they have shown a remarkable solidarity and a common detestation for the liberal center, crossing even the apparent chasm between extreme right and extreme left. A major reason for their solidarity and their increase is mass higher education itself. For most, this has little academic value, and one of the shared sentiments is resistance to being academically processed for the goals of the system. Nevertheless, the colleges and universities are, in fact, many hundreds of physical and social communities of young people with populations of a few thousand to 25,000, sharing a subculture, propagandizing one another, and learning to distrust anybody over 30. Such collections of youth are a social phenomenon unique in history. Nor are these young people properly called youth. The exigencies of the American system have kept them in tutelage, doing lessons till 23 and 24 years of age, years past when young industrial workers used to walk union picket lines, or when farmers carried angry pitchforks, or soldiers are now drafted into the army. Another cause of their shared resentment is the foolish attempt to arrest their maturation and regulate their social, sexual, and political activity. Unlike the suburban practice of making acquaintance by role, status, or caste, these young people live a good deal by interpersonal relations, as they call them, and are unusually careless in their friendships about status or getting ahead. I do not mean by this that they are especially affectionate or compassionate. They are averagely so. But they have been soaked in modern psychology, group therapy, sensitivity training, and as a style they go in for direct confrontation and sometimes brutal frankness. Add to this the lack of embarrassment due to animally uninhibited childhood. They are the post-Freudian generation. Their parents were analyzed from 1920 to 1940. The effect, for example, long sessions of mutual analysis or jabber about LSD trips can be tiresome, but it is pretty fatal to suburban squeamishness, race and moral prejudice, and maintaining appearances. Middle-class privacy vanishes. An innovation of the Beats was the community use of one another's pads, and this spirit of sharing has persisted in off-campus university communities, which are very different from paternalistic dormitories or fraternity row. In big cities, there are growing bohemian student neighborhoods, tending to be located in racially mixed sections, and such neighborhoods, with their own coffee houses and headquarters for student political clubs, cannot be controlled by campus administration. In the famous insurrection of Berkeley, Telegraph Avenue could easily rally 3,000 students, ex-students, wives, and pals. The response of the administration of the University of California has been, characteristically, to try to root up the neighborhood with federally financed urban renewal. The community meaning of the widespread use of hallucinogenic drugs is ambiguous. Few students use addictive drugs. I have heard students hotly defend the drugs as a means of spiritual and political freedom, or hotly condemn them as the quietest opium of the people, or indifferently dismiss them as a matter of taste. But they do not operate like the chummy alcoholism of the fraternity suburbs in Washington. And of course, being illegal and hard to procure, they tend to create conspiracy. The LSD cult especially must be understood as part of a wave of religiosity that has included Zen, Christian and Jewish existentialism, a kind of psychoanalytic yoga, and the Book of Changes. We have seen that on the campus, the young chaplain is often the center of action. Certainly, the calculating rationalism of modern times is losing its self-evidence. The shagginess and chosen poverty of the student communities have nuances that are immensely important. We must remember that these are the young of the affluent society, used to a high standard of living, and confident that, if and when they want, they can fit in and make good money. Having suffered little pressure of insecurity, they have little psychological need to climb, just as, coming from impeccably respectable homes, they feel no disgrace about sitting a few nights in jail. By confidence, they are aristocrats en masse. At the same time, the affluent standard of living which they have seen is pretty synthetic, and very much of it is useless and phony, and the poverty of the students is not degraded or insecure, but decent, natural, and in many ways more comfortable than their parents' standard, especially if they can always corral obvious goodies like hi-fi equipment and motorcycles. Typically, they tour Europe on nothing, sleeping under bridges, but if they get really hungry, they can drop in at American Express. Most of the major satisfactions of life, sex, paperback books, guitars, roaming, conversation, and activist politics, indeed cost very little. Thus, they are the first generation in America selective of the standard of living. If this attitude became general, it would be a disaster for the expanding GNP. And there is an unmistakable tone of policy and defiance in their poverty and shagginess. They have been influenced by the voluntary poverty of the Beat movement, signifying withdrawal from the trap of the affluent economy. Finally, by acquaintance, they experience the harsher tone of the involuntary poverty of the Negroes and Spanish Americans whose neighborhoods they visit and with whom they are friends. The chief conscious drive of the radical young is their morality. As Mike Harrington has put it, they drive you crazy with their morality. since for it they disregard prudence in politics, and they mercilessly condemn legitimate casuistry as if it were utterly phony. When politically minded student leaders, like sometimes the Students for Democratic Society, engage in tactics and the art of the possible, they swiftly lose influence, whereas indignation or a point of honor will rally the young in droves. Partly, this drive to morality is the natural ingenuousness of youth, freed of the role-playing and status-seeking of our society. As aristocrats, not driven by material or ulterior motives, they will budge for ideals or not at all. Partly, their absolutism is a disgusted reaction to cynicism and the prevalent adult conviction that nothing can be done, you can't fight City Hall, modern life is too complex. But mostly, I think, it is the self-righteousness of an intelligent and innocent new generation in a world where my own generation is patently stupid and incompetent. They have been brought up on a literature of devastating criticism that has gone unanswered because there is no answer. The philosophical words are authenticity and commitment from the existentialist vocabulary. And it cannot be denied that our dominant society is unusually inauthentic. Newspeak and double talk are the lingua franca of administrators, politicians, advertisers, and mass media. These people are not even lying. Rather, there is an unbridgeable chasm between the statements made for systemic reasons or the image of the corporation and what is intended and actually performed. I have seen mature graduate students crack up in giggles of anxiety listening to the Secretary of State expound our foreign policy. When I questioned him afterwards, some said that he was like a mechanical man, others that he was demented. And most campus blow-ups have been finally caused by administrators' animal inability to speak. The students have faithfully observed due process and manfully stated their case, but the administrators simply could not talk like human beings. In principle, commitment proves authenticity. You must not merely talk, but organize, collect money, burn your draft card, go south and be shot at, go to jail. And the young eagerly commit themselves. However, a lasting commitment is hard to achieve. There are a certain number of issues that are pretty authentic and warrant engaging in. Give Negroes the vote, desegregate a hotel or bus, practice fair employment, commute Chessman's sentence to the gas chamber, abolish grading and get the CIA out of the university, get out of Vietnam, legalize marijuana and homosexuality, unionize the grape pickers. But it is rarely the case that any particular authentic cause can really occupy the thought and energy of more than a few for more than a while. Students cool off and hop from issue to issue. Then some become angry at the backsliders. Others foolishly try to prove that civil liberties, for instance, are not so important as Negro civil rights, for instance, or that university reform is not so important as stopping the bombing of Hanoi. Others, disillusioned, sink into despair of human nature, and committed causes vanish from view at the June vacation when the community disperses. The bother is that except with a few political or religious personalities, the students' commitments do not spring from their own vocations and life ambitions, and they are not related in a coherent program for the reconstruction of society. This is not the fault of the students. Most of the present young have unusually little sense of vocation. Perhaps 16 continuous years of doing lessons by compulsion is not a good way to find identity, and there is no acceptable program of reconstruction. Nobody has spelled it out. There are only vague criteria. Pathetically, much definite commitment is a self-deceptive way of filling the void of sense of vocation and utopian politics. Negroes, who are perforce really committed to their emancipation, notice this and say that their white allies are spiritually exploiting them. It is a terrible period for the young to find vocation and identity. For most of the abiding human vocations and professions, arts and sciences seem to them, and are, corrupt. Law, business, the physical sciences, social work, these constitute the hated system. And higher education, both curriculum and professors, which ought to be helping them find themselves, also seems corrupt and part of the system. Students know that something is wrong in their schooling, and they agitate for university reform. But since they do not know what new world they want to make, they do not know what to demand to be taught. It is not the task of 20-year-olds to devise a coherent program of social reconstruction, to rethink the uses of technology and resources, methods of management, city planning, and international relations. And they rightly accuse my generation of not providing them a program to work for. A small minority, I think increasing, return to Marxism, but the Marxist theorists have also not thought of anything new and relevant to overmature societies. What the American young do know, being themselves pushed around, itemized, and processed, is that they have a right to a say in what affects them. That is, they believe in democracy, which they have to call participatory democracy to distinguish it from double-talk democracy. Poignantly, in their ignorance of American history, they do not recognize that they are Congregationalists, town meeting Democrats, Jeffersonians, populists. But they know that they want the opportunity to be responsible, to initiate and decide instead of being mere personnel. Returning from the term overseas, the first 1,000 of the Peace Corps unanimously agreed that exercising responsibility and initiative had been the most worthwhile part of their experience. And they complained that back home they would not have the opportunity. Last year at Harvard, more seniors opted for the Peace Corps than for business. The primary area for seeking democracy would be, one would imagine, the universities, for that is where the students are and are coerced. But unfortunately, as we have seen, the majority of students do not care about higher education as such. They're in college for a variety of extrinsic reasons, from earning the degree necessary for getting a salary to evading the draft. There is no mass base for university reform in the universities. Mainly, instead of working in their own bailiwick, the radical students have sought participatory democracy for poor people, organizing rent strikes, marching for Negro suffrage, opposing the welfare, and so forth. But again, there is an inherent dilemma. Negroes claim, perhaps correctly, that middle-class whites cannot understand their problems. And if Negroes are going to run their own show, they have to dispense with white helpers. The present policy of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is that Negroes must solve their own peculiar problems, which are the only ones they care about and know anything about, and let their young white friends attend to changing the majority society. There is something in this. But pushed too far, any separation consigns poor people to a second-class humanity. Some pressing problems are universal. The poor must care about them. For example, the atom bombs. Many problems are grossly misconceived if looked at from a poor man's point of view. Only a broad human point of view can save Negroes from agitating for exactly the wrong things. For example, the educational parks, when what is needed in schooling is small human scale. Also, there is something spurious in the separation. For a poor minority in a highly technological and middle-class society will not engineer the housing and manufacture the cars, etc., that they intend to use. Finally, in fact, the Negroes are, perhaps unfortunately, much more American than Negro. Especially in the North, they aspire to the same American package, though it makes even less sense for them than for anybody else. The Negro subculture that is talked up has about the same value as the adolescent subculture, with which it shares many traits in common. It has vitality, and it does not add up to humanity. As in other periods of moral change, only the young aristocrats and the intellectuals can afford to be disillusioned and profoundly radical. In their own action organizations, the young are almost fanatically opposed to top-down direction. In several remarkable cases, gifted and charismatic student leaders have stepped down because their influence had become too strong. By disposition, without benefit of history, they have reinvented anarchist federation and a kind of Luxemburgian belief in spontaneous insurrection from below. They tend to the kind of nonviolent resistance in which each one makes his own moral decision about getting his head broken, rather than submitting to rigid discipline. All this, in my opinion, probably makes them immune to takeover by centralists like the Marxists. When Trotskyists, for example, infiltrate an organization and try to control it, the rest go home and activity ceases. When left to their own improvisation, however, the students seem surprisingly able to mount quite massive efforts, using elaborate techniques of communication and expert sociology. By such means, they will never get power. But indeed, they do not want power. They want meaning. The operative idea in participatory democracy is decentralizing, to multiply the number who are responsible, initiate, and decide. In principle, there are two opposite ways of decentralizing. Either by dividing over centralized organization, where it can be shown that decentral organization is more efficient in economic, social, and human costs, or at least not too inefficient, or by creating new small enterprises to fulfill needs that big organizations neglect or only pretend to fulfill. Obviously, the first of these, to cut the present structures down to human size, is not in the power of students. But it happens that it does require a vast amount of empirical research and academic analysis to find if, where, and how it is feasible. In the current American style, there is no such research and analysis. And on 150 campuses, I have urged students to work on such problems in business and engineering, education and communications, science and municipal administration. The students seem fascinated, but I do not know if they are coming across. To say it wryly, there is an excellent organization called Students for a Democratic Society, but it is not enough evident that they are students for a democratic society. The opposite way of decentralizing, by creating new enterprises, better suits the students' zeal for direct action, and they have applied it with a lot of energy and inventiveness. It has been called parallel development. Typically, students have set up a dozen little free universities in or next to established institutions to teach in a more personal way and to deal with contemporary subjects that are not yet standard. For example, Castro's Cuba, the psychedelic experience, sensitivity training, theater of participation. Some of these courses are action sociology, like organizing labor or community development. Students have established a couple of neighborhood radio stations to broadcast local news and propaganda and to give poor people a chance to talk into a microphone. They have set up parallel community projects to combat the welfare bureaucracy and channelize real needs and grievances. In the South, they have helped form freedom political machines, since the established machines are lily white. They have offered to organize international service projects as an alternative to serving the army. Looked at coldly, such parallel projects are pitifully insignificant, doomed to pass away like little magazines. Yet they are a thrilling revival of the seemingly dead spirit of American populism. Get out from under the thumb of the barons and do it yourself. In my opinion, the important step is the first one, to prove that such things are possible at all. Then there is no telling how far they will go. There is a good hope for bringing to life many of our institutions by surrounding them with human enterprises, like a cambium or growing layer. The most telling criticism of an overgrown institution is a simpler one that works better. This was the educational vision of John Dewey 60 years ago, of an industrial society continually democratically renewed by its young people, freely educated and learning by doing. Progressive education, free-spirited but practical, was a typical populist conception, and the student movement can be regarded as progressive education at the college and graduate school level, where it begins to be indistinguishable from vocation and politics. It is the antithesis of a Mandarin establishment and the social engineering that we now call education. Maybe this time around, it will work. By and large, this is as yet the disposition of a minority of the young. But it is the only articulate disposition that has emerged, and it has continuously emerged for the past 10 years. It is a response not merely to issues like civil rights of Vietnam, but to deeply rooted defects in our present system, and it will have an influence in the future. Those who think it is the usual generational revolt that will be absorbed as the students get older and wiser are whistling in the dark. If it is not taken seriously and compounded with, the result will be ever-deepening alienation and ultimately worse disruption.
Dr. Paul Goodman, the CBC's 1966 Massey lecturer, with his second of 6 lectures called The Moral Ambiguity of America. Part 1 of tonight's Best of Ideas. Ken Haslam speaking.
This is the CBC Radio Network.
The Best of Ideas presents the Massey Lectures for 1966. Dr. Paul Goodman, whose teaching and writing have shaped the political philosophy of many concerned North Americans, has been invited by the CBC to present 6 talks for which he has chosen the theme of the moral ambiguity of America. Tonight, the third Monday evening in this series, Paul Goodman gives his third talk for the CBC, in which he critically discusses the morality of scientific technology. Dr. Goodman.
The empty style of our society pervades most functions and institutions. In recent books, I have described it in education and in our manner of social organization. In the next 2 lectures, let me single out how we think about scientific technology and urbanization. It is becoming common among social philosophers to treat the progress of science and technology as if it now goes on by itself and determines everything else. Something like the Marxist relations of production, but even less dependent on human choice. Whatever men wish, the independent development of scientific technology will shape the future. In more drastic versions of the theory, technology has already changed man into a product of itself. For example, has changed the nature of human perception, or man has become one special function in the technical system. Yet the gross history of the past 100 years does not reveal this free-floating technology. Scientific technology has certainly affected with its products, processes, and method most human beings in nearly every human function. In large areas, it has created an artificial landscape and altered the balance of species. It has gotten off the planet and may destroy a good part of life on the planet. But invariably, in its quantity and direction of development, scientific technology has been in the employ of familiar human motives, either convenience, health, and excitement, or profits, power, and the aggrandizement of persons or groups. It has not been independent. On the contrary, it can be shown that the organization of recent scientific technology has by and large moved away from the traditional research autonomy of science and the principle of efficiency of technology, and under political, military, and economic control. If they were organized in their own terms, science and technology would be very differently organized. At present, there is a waste of scientists' time and brains, and engineers are not allowed to decide like real professionals. And the increasing moral and ritual drives to standardization, rationalization, control, and self-control, what Max Weber called the Protestant ethic, have not, in my opinion, been mainly due to technical routine, but to new psychological obsessions to ward off insecurity and compulsions to identify with power. Since I intend to complain about the present morale of scientific technology, let me first make clear what I do not complain of. Science is autonomous, because knowledge must be pursued for its own sake as part of the human adventure. Despite the risks involved, for instance in nuclear physics, most people honor this claim. I do. Also, technology is grounded in the human principle that you must give a workman the best tool, otherwise he is degraded. Despite the disruptions sometimes involved, for instance by automation, most people are not Luddite and do not oppose technological advance. I do not. Apart from these basic principles, however, the meaning of both science and technology has changed radically in the past 50 years. The often repeated statement that there are more scientists now alive than existed in all previous time ought to put us on the alert. How do these new multitudes of scientists take themselves? How are they in the world? The present orthodox philosophy of scientific technology is that there is something called pure science or basic research which is morally neutral, except for the drive toward knowledge. Its inquiries may or may not lead to anything useful. Useful findings are applied and become part of the system of technology. This is a peculiar position and quite untraditional. What is neutral science and what is applied science? There is a difference between science and technology. It is reasonable to make the Aristotelian distinction between science as an act of wonder, disinterested curiosity, and aesthetic construction, and technique as the empirical rules of thumb for efficient practice. But especially since the Renaissance, natural philosophers would not have made a big deal of such a distinction. In fact, of course, science and technology have rarely gone separate ways anyway. It would be odd if they had. What is striking is that the doctrine of pure science and its moral neutrality always comes to the fore when scientists are assigned an official status and become salaried or subsidized, as in the German universities in the 19th century or in America today. It looks like an attempt on the part of the scientists to affirm their identity and protect themselves against officious interference by managers. But it is also, I am afraid, a self-deception and a hoax on the public. In America at present, the great bulk of the billions of dollars for science is for research on extrinsically chosen problems, or even on particular products. A large part of the training of scientists in the universities is toward rather narrow technological expertness. Of nearly $20 billion annually marked for research and development, more than 90% is actually devoted to last-stage designing of hardware for production. Corporations mark up prices 1,000% in order, they say, to pay for basic research, but much of the research is to bypass other firms' patents. It is hard to credit that this kind of science is disinterested and that promoters are not using the prestige of science as a talking point. It is taken for granted that amazing new developments will, if possible, at once be sequestered for military use and sometimes be made secret. Lasers will be death rays. The adventure of space will end in orbiting missile sites. The chief use of drugs that influence behavior will be to paralyze an enemy's will to resist. Anthropology is for counterinsurgency studies in primitive countries, and even the benevolent dolphins are to be trained as kamikaze submarines. Unfortunately, this is not a caricature. Then it is dismaying to hear dedicated scientists explain that they are allowed perfect freedom to do restricted publication research, and that any theoretical problem is indifferently good for the progress of science. The simplest explanation of the proposition that there are more scientists alive today than existed up to now is that business as usual has co-opted science. Make an historical contrast. During the heroic age of modern science, say from the 16th through the 18th centuries, natural philosophers believed, uncritically and perhaps naively, that they directly confronted the nature of things and were engaged in a kind of dialogue with nature with a capital N. Each man was solitarily engaged in this open dialogue, which might lead in any direction, but since all were engaged in a common enterprise on the frontier of knowledge, they eagerly communicated with one another by publication, academies, depositing theses in university libraries, and enormous correspondence by letter. The duty of publication, therefore, to allow others to replicate the experiment, became part of the definition of science. By it, one became honored as the first, the discoverer. One is puzzled as to what restricted scientific information can mean. Does replicable mean replicable by those cleared by the FBI? During the heroic period, science was not the social orthodoxy. Indeed, a disproportionate number of the natural philosophers were exploring forbidden territory and publishing defiantly. They were not getting any grants. Their image was rough and morose, or moonstruck and bumbling. Their claim to freedom of inquiry was grounded not in a formal distinction about role, but in a civil conflict about content. This confirmed their solidarity as a rebellious band. They were not morally neutral, nor was nature morally neutral. Nature was wonderful or horrible or fascinating. She was surely beyond ordinary human uses, but she abounded in moral as well as practical lessons for human betterment. In their hearts, I am sure, many scientists still belong to the ancient band, just as many academics still vote with Abelard. Sometimes a great scientist talks the old language. Old-fashioned moralists hanker after a natural ethics or a scientific way of life. But the official position is quite otherwise. Science is no longer a dialogue with nature, but it is regarded as a system of expanding knowledge that is self-correcting, something like Hegel's progressive absolute idea. It is to this self-contained system that scientists are dedicated and which they serve with a special method, practiced with formal scrupulosity, so that it sometimes seems to be the correct method rather than the content that constitutes scientific truth. Rather than banded individuals, scientists have become an organized priesthood, and their system has become the major orthodoxy of modern society. It is the system of ideas that everybody, including myself, believes, whether or not one knows anything about it. The popular feeling about it contains both superstitious reverence and superstitious fear, and the current mass education in science, we shall see, does not allay these. The shift of emphasis from an open dialogue of morose or bumbling men with surprising nature to an elite service to a progressive, self-correcting system of knowledge has been accompanied by immense changes in the social organization of science, the role of the scientist, and the engagement of the man as a person in the role. There is now less use for individual genius and hunch, nor for a personal ethical choice of a field of search as peculiarly fascinating, congenial, or good. The issue is not, let me make clear, whether the field is benevolent or useful, for it has often been the hallmark of scientific genius to research the senseless, the apparently trivial, the pathological. But I doubt that an older-style scientist paid attention to what he considered indifferent. His work was suffused with himself, and it is my Wordsworthian bias that scientists and artists, formed by their disinterested conversation with meaning, are usually good people. When a study is pursued as indifferently scientific, however, it is likely that extrinsic purposes will dictate the direction that is taken. Inevitably, there is a pressure for payoff results rather than the wandering dialogue with surprise. A scientist becomes personnel, pursuing the goals of the organization. More fatefully, as a great successful institution, the system of knowledge has become interlocked with the other great institutions of society, and the dominant style takes over. But this style was not devised for open dialogue with surprise. It was devised for cash accounting, tax collection, military discipline, logistics, and mass manufacture. Yet bureaucratic methods must somehow be appropriate to science too. Committees must be able to evaluate projects. There must be profiles of gifted persons to give grants to, and there must be university courses relevant to training other gifted persons. Scientific thinking must be able to be parceled out for efficient division of labor, and discoveries must occur on schedule, starting with basic research and going to application, development, shaping up for production. With enough capital, we must be able to mount a crash program and break through. To be serviceable, excellent scientists become administrators. Grant getters who are clever about the forms become scientists. Corporations become impresarios for scientists. Scientific brains from other countries are brought up to work in the American style on American problems, seriously impoverishing their own peoples and precluding the development of various schools of thought. In the end, unless an hypothesis involves big cash, its author cannot afford to pursue it, though he used to love it. The rationalization is ready to hand. Modern science requires big capital and big organization, they say. Take cyclotrons, moonshots, statistical surveys, universal information retrieval. These are now considered as science par excellence. There has been a redefinition of science. Bypassing the hypothetico-deductive experience of nearly 400 years, we have amazingly come back full circle to the bureaucratic system described in Bacon's Novum Organum. It is hard to know whether the corporate style of research is really the best one, for it tends to be self-proving. If brainy people agree to operate in this manner, they are not operating in some other manner, and we do not know what they should be producing. Yet there is a curious body of evidence compiled by the Antitrust Committee of the United States Senate that shows rather overwhelmingly that in recent decades, even in practical research and development, the majority of significant advances have not come from big corporations and big universities and have not been sponsored by foundations and government. They have still come from lonely and often rejected individuals, from random amateur inventors, partnerships, tiny firms where the scientists, technicians, and craftsmen have a chance to talk to one another. One would expect this to be still more so in pure science. Let me make myself clear once again. I am not opposed to heavy subsidies for science. It is one of the few things that make it worthwhile to be human. No price can be set on it. But, like art, perhaps science is hard to buy directly. Perhaps the best we can do is to provide a decent society in which people can be themselves, and children can grow up with their lively curiosity not too stultified. By definition, anything radically new must seem far-fetched, except to its innovator. A committee will not understand it. Certainly, as public policy, if only to increase the general cultivation, I would decentralize subsidies for science as widely as possible, rather than, as we do, letting the money go to a few managers. The morality of technology has also suffered a sea change. Historically, the main origin of technology, in the work of craftsmen, miners, navigators, etc., provided a ready check on utility, efficiency, costs, unforeseen effects. A secondary but important origin of technology, in the natural experiments of medieval and Renaissance alchemists and magicians and perhaps physicians, provided no such check. The archetypal story is the sorcerer's apprentice. But therefore, these groups had a strong ethical code to permit only white magic, and prescribing Christian virtue as the priceless ingredient of the magician's philosopher's stone. The black magician, like our mad scientist, was a villain for popular tragedy. But even with the Industrial Revolution and the capitalization of machinery, finally for cash profits rather than any other purpose, the market itself provided a check on the cheapness of the process and the utility of the products, although of course the whole cash system was notoriously careless of social costs and remote effects like enclosure, slums, air pollution, slag heaps, and the exhaustion of resources. In principle, the discipline of political economy was, and is, supposed to regulate costs and benefits so as to guarantee the general good. In this discipline, the use and extent of a technology are subject to prudence, including safety, caution because of the possibility of unforeseen disadvantages, forethought to prevent overcommitment, and concern for the shape and function of the whole environment. The history, alas, has been different. Political economy did not devote itself to these matters, but to the gross national product measured in cash. Its advice was and is how to maximize technological growth to increase the abstract number of goods and services, whatever their quality or mutual contradictions. The check of the market has been weakened by subsidies, cost-plus contracts, monopolies, price-fixing, advertising, and the ignorance of consumers. And the various technologies increasingly interlock and depend on one another in a vast and recondite system, so that it has become fantastically difficult, even for experts, to decide what is by and large useful, cheap, or even safe. No one at all can trace the remote effects. And the control of the systems of technology is lodged in managers who finally are not interested in efficiency, not to speak of prudence. They are not in business for technical or citizenly reasons, but to make money. There ceases to be a morality of technique at all. A technician is hired to execute a detail of a program handed down to him. Apart from honestly trying to make his detail work, he is not entitled to criticize the program itself in terms of its efficiency, common sense, beauty, effect on the community, or human scale. If management is not concerned with these things either, a technician must often lend his wits to ludicrous contradictions. Cars are designed to go faster than it is safe to drive. Food is processed to take out the nourishment. Weapons are stockpiled that only a maniac would use. The interlocking of systems of technology without the direct check of personal acquaintance and use, and political prudence, creates a series of booby traps. Human scale may be quite disregarded, the time and energy that people actually have, the space they need to move in, and the rhythm or randomness with which they best operate. As the engineer designs, we move, or sometimes can't move. Fast trips are made possible by jet plane, but they prove to chop up our lives to involve longer trips to airports and more waiting in terminals, so we have less free time. Business machines are installed, and there is no longer any person from whom to get information or service for one's particular case. The cities spread so far that one can't get out of them. The country is deserted, so it is inefficient to provide means to get to it. Immense printing presses and other means of communication are devised, but to warrant such an investment of capital requires a mass audience, and it becomes hard to publish a serious book or transmit a serious message. This sounds like chaos, and modern life pretty nearly is. Apart from the cure of infectious diseases, some public services, and some household and farm equipment, there have been few recent advances in technique that have not proved to be a mixed bag in actual convenience. The great advantages on balance that came from universalizing basic conveniences or necessities, like electricity or water supply, do not necessarily occur when massifying comforts and luxuries. The moral advantages of enriched opportunity are largely delusory. New opportunities do not make time available to enjoy them, and the chance for choice works out as superficial acquaintance and confusion. The marvels of fable, like flying through the air and seeing at a distance, have not proved so beautiful in reality. It is not hard to fantasize the use of our high technology that would be neat, uncomplicated, rich, and educative. But it is significant that utopian writers have stopped fantasizing in this direction. The fact remains that countries with a fifth or a tenth of our available technology have a way of life that is as good or better. I do not mean by this argument that we ought to cut back our technology, for human beings are bound to try out everything. But there is a problem here that we have no right to disregard as we do. Let me suggest two kinds of remedies to restore morale to scientific technology. The first is to judge technology directly in terms of the moral criteria appropriate to it as a branch of practical philosophy. Utility, efficiency, comprehensibility, repairability, flexibility, amenity, relevance, modesty. By utility, I mean, for instance, not building obsolescence into expensive machines as if they were children's toys. By efficiency, I mean especially not overriding the competence of technicians for the demands of the system, not disregarding thrift merely for convenience of administration. For instance, radical decentralization of production would often save on costs, as well as giving more control to those who do the work. By comprehensibility of design and concern for repairability, we might alleviate the growing ineptitude of users and their bondage to repairmen and corporation service stations. By flexibility of use, we might stave off the increasingly frequent disasters that occur when interlocking systems of technology break down as a whole because of stoppage in a part. We might ease the entry of small enterprises and new regions into the economy. By amenity, I mean concern for the whole range of feelings, not trivial like getting rid of billboards, but the frayed nerves of traffic congestion, the destruction of cities by freeways, the chewing up of landscape for quick profits and transient convenience, not breeding out the taste and maturity of food for the convenience of processes and packages. By relevance, I mean concern for human scale, the time, size, energy, need for space of actual people, rather than calculating efficiency in abstract units of time, space, and energy. By modesty, I mean not looming larger than a function warrants, caution about hasty commitment and overcommitment, which by now have given us several generations of slums of engineering and piles of junk. Another valuable consideration is to check competition in technology when an enterprise reaches a size and expense that makes it a natural monopoly that should be regulated in the public interest or nationalized. At present, I think this applies especially to automating, where it is absurd to duplicate immense concentrations of tools, though it might be wise radically to decentralize the programming. Such a moral program is, I say, obvious. yet it is revolutionary and beyond our present political means. Nevertheless, in my opinion, a lot could be done if technicians would take the lead and insist on acting like professionals. Much could be done also by a different kind of mass education in science. I agree with the current wisdom that in a world pervaded with scientific technology, a great part of the curriculum must be scientific. The question is for what purpose and how. At present, there is some effort to teach the excitement and beauty of science and natural truth, and to get great men to give the TV lessons. This is laudable. But the chief purpose of the most recent curriculum reform seems to me to be wrong-headed. It is to process PhDs in science, or even to educate creative scientists, and the method is to teach the latest findings. The time of the vast majority who are not going on to scientific careers is utterly wasted. Yet it is likely that most of those who are scientifically gifted will follow their bent anyway. We really do not know how to educate for creative genius. And it is not the case, as is claimed, that in a high technology, average workmen need extensive scientific schooling. On the contrary, a few weeks to a year on the job, rather than years of lessons, is still the best way to train adequate low-level technicians. Entirely neglected in the present scientific curriculum, however, is what science is as a way of being in the world. For instance, its austerity and honesty. For this, it is worse than useless for the average student to learn answers for the College Board examinations. This turns the whole thing into an abstraction or a hoax. It has nothing to do with reality. There should be heavy emphasis on becoming at home in the actual technology, to restore the sense of causal control over things, rather than feeling powerless among things. As a part of social studies, a major subject should be the economics, politics, and organization of science and technology. I do not see any way for the average citizen to be able to judge the substantive issues relevant to the vast sums for research and development that we have to spend. But it would be helpful if he understood the interests and politics involved in the spending. With regard to one area of science, however, it is essential that citizens do learn to judge the substantive issues. This is human ecology, combining physical science, hygiene, sociology, and political economy to analyze problems of urbanism, transportation, pollution, degenerative disease, mental disease, pesticides, indiscriminate use of antibiotics and other powerful drugs, and so forth. These matters are simply too important to be delegated to experts. A few years ago, C.P. Snow created a stir by speaking of the chasm between two cultures, that of the scientists and that of the humanists. Since we live in times dominated by scientific technology, he castigated the humanists especially for not knowing the other language. Sir Charles posed the issue wrongly. There is only one culture, and probably the scientific technologists have betrayed it most. Science, the dialogue with the unknown, is itself one of the humanities, and technology, practical efficiency, is a part of moral philosophy. Scientific technology has become isolated by becoming subject to the empty system of power. The remedy is for scientists and technicians to reassert their own proper principles, and for ordinary people to stop being superstitious and to reassert their own control over their own environment. Then there will be communication again.
Dr. Paul Goodman with his third talk in this year's Massey Lectures, organized for the CBC by Robert McCormick and produced in our New York studios by Del McKenzie. The Best of Ideas, Part 1. Ken Haslam
This is
speaking.
the CBC Radio Network.